Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Helen Jewett was born Dorcas Doyen in the year 1814 in the small city of Temple in Franklin County in Maine. Her father, named John, worked as a labourer, while her mother, Sally, earned her income as a shoebinder. Helen's father had the habit of squandering much of his earnings on alcohol, which only worsened the already poor circumstances in which the family lived. Helen was a pleasant child and was great assistance to her mother, who sadly passed away in 1822, when Helen was just 8 years old. However, despite her grief, Helen bravely shouldered the responsibility of cooking and cleaning, while her father went out to work. She was a pretty girl, and was also known to be polite and good-natured. However, after her father died, she was sent away to work as a servant. Now aged 13, she found herself employed in the household of Mr. Nathan Weston, the Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Judicial Court. It was rumoured that he was moved by the young girl's plight and felt a sense of compassion towards her. In this arrangement, Helen was to fulfil her duties in domestic service until her 18th birthday, and Mr. and Mrs. Weston would care for her and provide her with an education. Despite the demanding nature of her work, this opportunity presented Helen with the chance to immerse herself in refinement and etiquette. Living with such a distinguished and respected family provided her with exposure to culture and manners that she would not have encountered otherwise. Additionally, she was granted access to Judge Weston's personal library, where she developed a passion for reading. As the years passed, the young girl's striking beauty became a topic of widespread discussion. However, alongside the admiration for her appearance, there were whispers about some of her more questionable actions. By the time she had reached the age of 17, she found herself embroiled in an escapade with a young banker from Portland in Maine. The scandalous nature of their involvements stirred considerable attention and gossip. This caused her guardian to take drastic action and expel her from the household. With little choice, Helen accompanied the young man back to Portland, but their relationship came to an abrupt end due to their constant disagreements. Helen now sought refuge in Augusta, where she took up residence in a brothel managed by a lady named Mrs. Burras. It was not long before she adopted a new identity, casting aside the name Dorcas Doyen and now calling herself Miss Helen Marr. But before too long she moved on, this time to Boston, and a few months later she decided to try her luck on the bustling streets of New York. Again she changed her name, and this time she told anyone who inquired that she was Miss Helen Jewett. With few options and in need of shelter and money, she went back into prostitution. She was invited to work at an upscale bordello at 41 Thomas Street, owned by Madame Rosina Townsend. However, this establishment was different, as the young women did not work as mere prostitutes. Instead, they embraced the art of refinement and sophistication and were considered more like courtesans. Among the patrons were gentlemen of much wealth and influence, including those from the legal profession, law enforcement, and even politicians. The men who came to see Helen were not only drawn to her beauty and charm, they were also impressed by her knowledge and intelligence. She enjoyed reading books, knew about political matters, and loved to write. Her engagements with them were not considered as just transactions. Instead, they unfolded as romantic affairs, marked by secret rendezvous, lavish gifts, and intimate letters, all of which cultivated a sense of genuine affection and connection. But however Helen saw her entry into this realm, be it as a means of survival or a pursuit of independence, she was aware that this was a world of vice and temptation, where the allure of easy money collided with her own moral principles. With each passing day she descended deeper into the murky depths of this profession. Her innocence was being eroded by the harsh realities of life as an upmarket prostitute. Yet despite this, she found moments of fleeting joy. She liked to walk along the boulevards, where her striking appearance and demeanour would always catch the eye of passing gentlemen. Although she received much attention, Helen soon discovered that it was not easy for a young woman alone in the heart of New York City in the 1830s. A young man who came to the city around the same time as Helen was named Richard Robinson. He was from the town of Durham in Middlesex County, Connecticut, and as a teenager had been known for his solid build and immaculate appearance, a reflection of the values instilled on him by his parents. When he was old enough to leave home, he too went to New York, where he found employment as a clerk in a well-known dry goods store named Joseph Hox's that had its premises on Maiden Lane. However, with all the excitement of city life, he found himself drawn to a crowd of dubious characters and adopted the alias Frank Rivers. One evening in 1834, while on his way to the theatre, Richard Robinson stumbled upon a confrontation between a thuggish-looking man and a captivating young woman. Moved by a sense of duty, he intervened. Grateful for his assistance, the young woman extended him an invitation to meet her after the show. Intrigued by the encounter and curious about the enigmatic lady, Mr. Robinson accepted. When he read the card, he discovered that the lady's name was Miss Helen Jewett, and the address she provided was 41 Thomas Street. This address was already known to him, as he would sometimes visit Madame Rosina Townsend's bordello, where he would see a young lady named Miss Maria Stevens. But now impressed by Miss Jewett's striking appearance, Mr. Robinson eagerly accepted the invitation, and the next time he visited the establishment, he asked to see her instead. From this point on, he visited Helen regularly, but within a few weeks, her feelings for the young man grew beyond the boundaries of their professional arrangement. Instead, it became a passionate infatuation. However, as time passed, she began to suspect that his attention was divided among other interests and feared that she was not receiving his full attention. At the beginning of 1836, Helen grew increasingly convinced that Richard Robinson intended to marry another woman. Aware of his intricate business affairs, she confronted him with a veiled threat of exposure. Later, in an attempt to salvage their relationship, she reached out to reconcile, expressing the affection she had towards him. However, her final words in a letter carried a warning. "You have known how I have loved. Do not provoke the experiment of seeing how I can hate." Richard Robinson dismissed Helen's threats. In his reply, he wrote, "You are never so foolish as when you threaten me. Keep quiet until I come on Saturday nights, and then we will see if we cannot be better friends hereafter." In the early morning of Sunday the 10th of April 1836, Miss Townsend was awoken by a commotion. It was around 3 a.m. Investigating, she discovered the back door had been left open and a second-floor lamp had not been extinguished. Instead, it was flickering in the hallway. She looked around and checked on her girls. When she knocked on Helen's door, there was no reply, but there was a distinct smell of burning. Cautiously, she tried to enter the room, but as she did, thick black smoke poured out. She called out for Helen, but there was no response. She then shouted for help. The other girls and their male companions hastily evacuated the building and sought refuge on the streets. Fortunately, 3 watchmen arrived and were able to extinguish the blaze. As the smoke dispersed, a grisly sight emerged. Helen's lifeless body lay among the charred remains of the room. The watchman looked at her and noticed that there were wounds on her head. Soon the authorities arrived and conducted a thorough investigation of the scene. Dr. David Rogers examined the body and concluded that Helen had been attacked with a heavy instrument and had been killed with the first blow. Madame Townsend told officers that Helen had been visited that night by a young man known as Frank Rivers. She said that he had arrived wearing a dark cloak and joined Helen in her room, where they had shared a bottle of champagne. At first light, the night watchman searched Mrs. Townsend's yard and found a gentleman's cloak, an axe and a hatchet, which he surmised must have been left by the killer in his hurry to escape the scene. Police officers were then dispatched to 42 Day Street, the house where Mr. Richard Robinson resided. But when questioned, he denied all knowledge of the murder. Nevertheless, he was apprehended and placed under arrest. In an attempt to extract a confession, the police brought him to the scene of the crime. However, he remained eerily composed, displaying no sign of agitation, as he calmly refuted any involvement in the murder of Miss Helen Jewett. An inquest took place to find out what had happened in the early hours of Sunday morning that resulted in the death of the young woman. The main witnesses were Madame Townsend and the young ladies who resided at 41 Thomas Street. The cloak that had been recovered was presented, and the jury was told that the authorities believed that it belonged to Mr. Robinson. When the inquest ended, it was concluded that the poor girl had met her end due to blows inflicted with a hatchet, probably by the hand of Richard P. Robinson. He was then taken to a cell to await his trial. Newspapers immediately reported on the murder. The penny press seemed to take a lead in writing about the case, spreading sensationalised accounts of what had happened at Madame Townsend's bordello, and publishing many articles in their publications that had become widely available across the city. When the more established newspapers reported on the tragic event of a beautiful young woman who had been murdered in Thomas Street, they tried to balance the moral standards of the time against society's insatiable appetite for scandal. They wrote about the possible motivations that Frank Rivers or Richard Robinson may have had for committing this terrible act. Some alleged that he had embezzled money as a means to impress Helen, while others suggested that Helen had threatened him over his alleged impending marriage. Despite the ambiguity and sensationalism, most of the newspapers seemed to have seized on the opportunity for exposure and profit, churning out many columns that delved deeply into the circumstances surrounding the murder, all of which managed to capture the public's fascination into the case. Helen Jewett was buried on the 13th of April 1836. Her funeral was a sombre affair, attended by mourners and curious onlookers. The procession made its way to the cemetery, where she was laid to rest, in a grave marked by a simple headstone. The trial of Richard Robinson began on the 2nd of June 1836. His rich relatives in Connecticut had arranged for him to be defended by the renowned attorney, Ogden Hoffman. Soon many of the details regarding the events of the early hours of the 10th of April that had been vividly depicted in newspapers came under scrutiny. The district attorney questioned the brothel keeper, Rosina Townsend, who said that Helen Jewett's regular client on Saturday night was a man named Bill Easy. However, she insisted that Mr. Easy was not in her company on that fateful day. Instead, it was Mr. Robinson, who appeared at 9 o'clock, adopting the alias Frank Rivers. Madame Townsend recounted to the court that he concealed his face with a cloak and requested to see Miss Jewett. She further testified that upon arrival, she instructed him to wait and summoned Miss Jewett to the parlour. As the young couple began to ascend the stairs, Madame Townsend said that she overheard Miss Jewett say, "My dear Frank, I'm so glad to see you." Other young ladies who resided at Madame Townsend's establishments corroborated the story, including Miss Emma French, who told the court that it was indeed Frank Rivers that was with Helen late on the 9th of April. Other witnesses confirmed that the hatchet used in the murder bore a striking resemblance to the ones routinely utilised to open crates at the establishment where Mr. Robinson was employed. However, conflicting accounts arose, with some suggesting that the young women who worked at the bordello on Thomas Street were actively attempting to frame the defendant. Other witnesses called to testify included the coroner, Mr. William Sherman, and police officer Dennis Brink, who had inspected the property following Miss Jewett's death. Numerous pieces of circumstantial evidence emerged, each intriguing in its own right, but which consistently failed to definitely place Mr. Robinson in Helen's room on the night she was murdered. The defence presented their own witnesses, including Mr. Joseph Hoxie, who told the court of the impeccable conduct displayed by the young man throughout his 2 years of employment. The primary defence witness was a grocer named Mr. Robert Furlong, and he provided a compelling testimony. He recounted that on the 9th of April, Mr. Robinson came into his store at around 9:30 p.m. to purchase 25 cigars. According to Mr. Furlong, Mr. Robinson stayed in the store, where he engaged in conversation and smoked one of the cigars. He went on to say that when he closed the store at 10 p.m, Mr. Robinson remained outside, smoking another cigar and continuing the conversation. Mr. Furlong added that the old Dutch church chimed 10 while they conversed, so he could be sure of the time. He further testified that his store was approximately a mile from Thomas Street, and sometime later Mr. Robinson bid him good night, stating his intention to head home. His testimony was met with a noticeable hush in the courtroom. A man named Daniel Lyon, who was a keeper of the prison at Bellevue, told the court of how Mr. Furlong had come to the prison to speak to Mr. Robinson. He said that he was there for a while, and that Mr. Furlong told Mr. Robinson how he remembered that he came to his store and smoked cigars on the evening of the 9th of April and would go to court and testify on his behalf. Some did not believe that Mr. Furlong was being truthful in his testimony, and rumours circulated that he may have been coerced or bribed to provide his accounts. The prosecution wanted to present the threatening letters to the courts, which were supposedly sent by Mr. Robinson to Miss Jewett. However, Mr. Robinson's defence attorney, Ogden Hoffman, successfully kept these letters from being read, claiming that there was no proof that they had in fact been sent by his client. Newspapers continued to report the case daily, and some wrote that the testimony of the store owner, Mr. Furlong, was very compelling, and wondered if the case would come down to the word of a respected gentleman against that of Madame Townsend and the young women who worked in her establishment. Speculation was unnecessary as to which side the jury would likely favour. As both the prosecution and defence presented their cases, the judge proceeded to instruct the jury. Given that many of the witnesses were prostitutes, he directed the jury to discount their testimony. With the evidence against the defendant predominantly circumstantial in nature, the jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes before delivering a verdict of not guilty. A few months after the trial, Mr. Furlong's business failed, and in 1838, while on board a ship, he jumped into the sea and died. It was said that his mind had been corrupted, and that before his death, he admitted to fellow passengers that he had not told the truth at the trial. The personal letters that Mr. Robinson had written to Helen were released to the press. These revealed aspects of his character that contradicted his claims in court and depicted him as someone capable of malicious behaviour and lacking in the decorum expected of a gentleman. Consequently, public sentiment turned against him, with even some of his staunchest supporters distancing themselves from his company. With the press and the public now against him, Richard Robinson adopted the name Richard Parmalee and departed New York, embarking on a journey to Texas. It is believed that he eventually settled there and married in 1845. This marriage not only provided him with financial stability, but also elevated his social status. He went on to father 3 children and gained wealth from a mail business. It was reported that he died in Louisville in 1855, with some sensational accounts, which suggested that he uttered Miss Jewett's name on his deathbed, although how much truth there is in this claim remains uncertain. The case of Miss Helen Jewett remains a subject of historical interest and debate regarding issues of gender, class, and justice in early 19th century America. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.